Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Virginia Woolf's extended essay, A Room of One's Own. So the prompt that Woolf is essentially taking on in this essay is women and fiction. So according to this little frame narrative that Woolf constructs here, she was invited to give a lecture on women and fiction, and essentially what she sort of came to was kind of a stream of consciousness type approach to working through the problem. And in this case, there are some sections that are written in a stream of consciousness type fashion, particularly the very end of chapter 1, for instance. I'm not going to read it to you. Stream of consciousness basically means that the author puts on the page, the author writes in such a way that it's meant to reflect the continual flow and relative disjointedness, relative arbitrariness of the human thought process, right? So that's a style that people like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce really pioneered. But for the most part, A Room of One's Own is not necessarily written in stream of consciousness, but the ideas, as Woolf works through the ideas in the essay, it takes on a kind of macro stream of consciousness fashion. And what I mean by that is, over the course of the essay, there are all of these different experiences, musings, meditations, considerations, etc., that spring from one another. And it's not necessarily a sort of clear, linear approach to reasoning. It is a more chaotic form of reasoning or approach to reasoning that mirrors the thought process of the unconscious mind. So ultimately, though, Woolf does have a clear and coherent conclusion, a central argument that she makes, which is, as she sums it up for the beginning, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. So that's a fragment of one of her sentences. That's a piece of a larger sentence, but that coherently expresses the key point that she makes in this essay. She expands on this throughout, making various justifications, arguments, explanations, developments of this idea. But I think she restates it extremely clearly in her conclusion. And part of what she's referring to here, she refers to sons of Athenians, slaves, and dogs' chance of writing poetry. That connects to a quotation she's just given us from Sir Arthur Quiller Cowt, who makes those points about people in poverty in England. And he basically, it seems, so this is going to be an interesting question. I'm going to talk about this in terms of Woolf's argument. It seems like Sir Arthur takes the position almost that only people of privilege are likely to have the genius for writing poetry, whereas the poor, the working class, the underprivileged of various kinds, that genius is simply not found amongst them. Woolf sometimes seems to agree with this, but I think on the whole she doesn't necessarily. But what she does agree with, she says here, Intellectual freedom depends upon material things. Poetry depends upon intellectual freedom. And women have always been poor, not for 200 years merely, but from the beginning of time. Women have had less intellectual freedom than the sons of Athenian slaves. Women then have not had a dog's chance of writing poetry. That is why I have laid so much stress on money and a room of one's own. And I think this is a quite good argument. Hannah Arendt, in her book The Human Condition, about 30-some years later, I think The Human Condition comes out around 1958, if I'm not mistaken. I think sometime in the 50s. And Woolf's essay comes out in 1928. Hannah Arendt made the argument in The Human Condition that part of what allowed the ancient Athenians of the 6th through the 4th centuries BCE to be so artistically, literarily, philosophically, politically, mathematically, scientifically creative was because the society of Athenian citizens depended on a vast underclass of slaves, including, to a greater or lesser extent, the labor of Athenian women who even if they were nominally citizens, did not have citizenship rights in the sense of being able to participate in the Athenian democracy, etc., etc. It was only because the extorted labor of the slave class and Athenian women created the leisure time for Athenian aristocrats, men of property, and proper citizens to not do the labor required to actually live, the work of making food, or in a capitalist economy, earning a living, but they didn't have to do the work of raising crops. They didn't have to do the work of being tradespeople, constructing pottery or ships or whatever it is. They didn't have to do any of that. And so their time was freed up to think about philosophy, to develop theater, to write great art, to make great paintings, vase paintings, to construct monuments, etc., etc., to create democracy. Their time was freed up. Woolf takes this same basic premise, although she doesn't necessarily articulate it with the same historical context that Arendt does, but she argues that because women have never had leisure time, and by leisure time, I mean not just time when they aren't immediately working for the means of life, but time in which they are not subject to interruptions, right? So prior to the 20th century, and it's really the post-World War II period that women start acquiring reasonable amounts of leisure time in some cases, and that women start gaining an education that would prepare them to approach something like poetry or fiction. To a certain extent, this starts as early as, say, the 1860s or so, when I think the first women's colleges are founded in the United Kingdom. I don't know whether those were the earliest dedicated women's colleges in the world, but I think it was 1868, maybe, that Girton opens. Anyway, that's not important. The point is, because women have always been, or long been, basically for as long as there have been sedentary societies in the sort of broadly conceived Western tradition, women have been subject to continual demands upon their time. They've been subject to substantial amounts of emotional labor to support women, or to support children, to support men in their lives, to support family members, etc., etc. And all of those things are continual press upon one's time. And so, in that sense, even when women are not working traditionally, often as in housework, right? As in doing laundry, cooking, cleaning, mending things, making things for the household, etc., etc. They're subject to the possibility of continual interruption and continual addition to their tasks. And so it does take time to write. I mean, I'm a writer, primarily of scholarship, but I'm also doing creative writing. My partner is a writer. It takes time uninterrupted to think carefully and then to put something on paper and to work through those drafts. Without access to that leisure time, which can be guaranteed by an independent income, what Woolf says £500 a month, which in 1920, I didn't do the conversion. I didn't look it up, what that would be from 1928 money to today. But that would basically be an independent living, I won't call it a wage, but an independent income, right? So you're not financially dependent on someone. That's especially important for the history of women, because traditionally women have passed as property in Western patriarchal societies, as property from a father to a husband. They have only very recently been able to own their own property. In the US, for instance, it wasn't until the 1970s that women could open credit cards in their own name without their husband's permission. And so having access to independent income means that you are not dependent on someone else who may decide to cut you off from that money, who may decide to extort or blackmail you to prevent you from expressing yourself, whatever it is. And she says one needs, as the title of the essay suggests, a room of one's own with a lock on the door. You need a place where you can go to think, to create, to draft, to revise, to polish, etc., etc. And you need the financial independence in order to be able to do that. So I think that's basically a really, really good argument. It is, I would say, a proto-second wave feminist argument, because the principle really of the sort of central principle of second wave feminism, which really emerges in the 50s and then takes off in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, early 90s, where it sort of loses out increasingly to third wave feminism. The key principle of second wave feminism is really focused around women gaining access to the socio-cultural, political, business, and economic spaces that have traditionally been reserved for men. And a lot of that revolved around sort of this idea of breaking the glass ceiling, getting women into the top echelons of business, of politics, etc., but also of artistic endeavors, for women's art to be taken seriously alongside men's art. And Woolf is very much in favor of that. It's an incredibly important thing for her. But what she argues is that in order to achieve that, women need to express their own genius in their own way. And this is a thing that Woolf is very interested in. She spends a lot of time talking about this. For her, any art driven by or marked by grievance is going to inherently be incomplete, insufficient in some ways. And so feminist art, feminist novels, feminist poetry, this, incidentally, is quite marked by Woolf's anger at being denied an education, being denied access to university resources, to cultural resources, etc., etc. And I think she's aware of that. She's a very, very, very clever person. So I think she is self-aware enough to recognize that she is doing what she critiques in others, but she has this notion that great literature, great fiction will be a sort of authentic, unmediated expression of the author's genius. And this, there's this sort of like notion of a universal creative force here, which I think is somewhat problematic, because it does buy into the kind of sort of Western canon type thinking that says that someone like Shakespeare was a great author, whereas someone like Wole Soyinka is not going to be a great author because because Shakespeare is expressing universal themes, universal defined from the perspective of white European and American middle-class men, whereas Soyinka is expressing the concerns of his own time and place rather than universal concerns. These kinds of things. So there is a problematic element to this. But again, this was 1920, and so that sort of macro critique of the Western canon didn't really exist in Woolf's time. So it's a little bit unfair to hold her responsible for that. There's also some elements of classism here. The filthy pores can't write. The filthy pores can't be great artists. They can't be great writers. I think generally Woolf is not necessarily making the argument that by their very nature, poor people, working class people, women, etc., can't be creative geniuses. I think she is generally making the argument that it is circumstances that prevent the expression of that genius. And that is, I think, quite true. I mean, it is much, much easier to become a famous poet and get your books of poetry published if you have an education from the top poetry schools in the world, which costs money to attend, than it is if you don't have access to those resources. And so there is definitely a legitimate component to that. There are, however, other places in A Room of One's Own where Woolf does seem to be more assigning talent disproportionately based on socioeconomic class. Now, if you know anything about A Room of One's Own, you may have noticed that there is something that I did not mention yet, and I'm going to mention now at the very, very end of this video, but that it's a thing that is very often described as central to this essay. In fact, in the back here, this is the Harcourt edition. In the back description, it says, "In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf imagines that Shakespeare had a sister equal to Shakespeare in talent and equal in genius, but whose legacy is radically different." That's very, very often described as central to A Room of One's Own, but it really kind of isn't. It's central in that it comes up roughly in the middle of the essay, page 46 through 49, in this edition out of 114 pages. But it's an example. It's meant to illustrate the larger point that Woolf is making. This is not an essay about Shakespeare's imaginary sister. That is a piece of evidence that Woolf gives among a wide range of pieces of evidence that women need access to independent income or independent wealth, and they need privacy in order to express their artistic genius. So it's very, very interesting to me that this is frequently discussed as a book about Shakespeare's imaginary sister, as opposed to a book about the challenges that prevent women from expressing their artistic ideas or genius, which is the word that Woolf likes, in which she happens to imagine that Shakespeare had a sister.